Microphones make me nervous.
Well, I think what we're going to do is just have a real casual conversation, and we're hopeful that you will as well have some questions that you'll want to ask, and certainly please feel free. The Writers Institute at Georgia Permanent College has a visiting writer in residence program. We bring authors in twice a year, and we've been wanting to bring Joshilyn in for quite a while. So we're very happy to have her here. We're very happy to bring her to the Georgia Center for the Book and share her with the community at large. We've been going all day. We were out in Newton County all day today, so made our way back in against traffic, and we are here. I'm going to start this off by asking Joshilyn a question. Actually, today she did a great job. She made three people raise their hand, and they made those three people think of a question. And when she finished talking, then she said, "When are there questions?" Then there were questions, and we didn't have to sit around.
I hate that moment, that deer in the headlights moment, when we turn to you and say, "Are there questions?" And we look at you and you look at us, and there's silence, and it's like y'all are a herd of trucks and I'm a rabbit, and it's bad. So it's a good thing. It's a good thing to front load the questions. Think of it now, so that when we turn to you, you're already like, Mr. Cotta,
Yes, that would be very good. But I'm going to start by asking a question. And we had been chatting a little bit in the car on the way back from Social Circle today. And we were talking, kind of started talking about the girl who stopped swimming and about sort of place and geography, or not sense of place, but really just physical place. And we were talking about D-Lop or Delop. And Jocelyn said that she wanted to talk about that place because it was a dark and pretty tough place. And so I actually just went on the web for a minute and looked up some of the reviews and see if they mentioned anything about this, and as a way to just sort of set the question up. And Mountain Express did mention something about when they were reviewing The Girl Who Stopped Swimming. And Jocelyn, what they say is, this author reveals herself as a force to be reckoned with. Swimming is a ghost story, a murder mystery, an examination of family dysfunction, a discussion of the third world living conditions that exist right here in the U.S. And I thought that was an interesting way to sort of define a place in the United States. And so I thought maybe you might want to discuss that a little bit.
Sure, Jack. I'm going to get over this microphone in just a minute. Well, The Girl Who Stopped Swimming is a story about sisters. It's a sister book. I could say it's a book about poverty, and I could say it's a book about, there's a lot of things you can say that a book is about, but on the level of plot, and I do like a big old scoop of plot. I like things to happen. I like to blow stuff up. I want there to be some kissing. But so there's two ways to talk about a book: the under stuff and the on top stuff. I'm just going to talk about the on top stuff really quick so that there's a context for the under stuff. On the surface, it's a swimming book. It's a book about two sisters, Laurel and Thalia, and they're both women who work in the arts. One is a quilter who is in a very traditional female role: wife, mother, art quilter. The other has thrown all traditional female roles kind of out the window. And the two of them are estranged. They live very different lives. They haven't spoken in a couple of years. And I got interested in them because they came out of the same past. They share a ghost. Their family has a ghost. And they've gone their separate ways. And the book begins when a different ghost, the ghost of a little girl, about 13 years old, comes into Laurel's tidy, meticulous, gracious, and lovely bedroom and leads Laurel out to her own body in the family pool. And it's Laurel's little 13-year-old daughter's best friend. And it doesn't seem like it's an accident. Middle of the night, the child is in their pool, drowned. Something's going on. Something unseemly and unsavory is happening in their perfect whitewashed little neighborhood. And so she has to go and get Thalia, who is the walk-in definition of unseemly and unsavory. And together they try to find out what happens, because when that little ghost comes in, it opens the door to the ghost they share in their past, who she's locked out by living in this perfect, tidy subdivision. So part of the reason they come out of this past I call haunted, there's a literal ghost. It's a ghost story. It's a Southern Gothic book, but the real ghost in the story, the real thing that haunts them, is that they come out of poverty. And they come out of a kind of poverty that we don't think exists in the United States today. And it's not a Southern thing. I get real irritated when Yankee journalists ask me, is that what it's like down there in the South? And I'm like, no, we have shoes and television. It's fascinating in Georgia. So I get irritated because there's pockets like the town of DeLop all over this country. And this one, DeLop is where their mother is from. And I didn't grow up poor. I grew up I grew up poor like folks, like everybody, blue. My dad was in the army. We had Walmart. We went, it was just a normal. We shopped on Post, and it was just a normal. And my relatives were mostly poor like folks. They had lamps. It was just regular people, blue collar, small town Southern folks. And I had one grandmother who grew up in a kind of poverty that still exists today that I can't even imagine. She lived in a garden shed. She was a sharecropper. She basically grew up in what most people would consider to be a garden shed with 5 other people. In the summer, she slept out on the grass because their shed would be full of the cotton they had picked, their share of the cotton. And at the end of the picking season, they'd sell that, and that was their money for the year. She married at 14 to get she grew up knowing what it was to be hungry. And at 14, she found a boy to marry her who had a factory job. And he was also on a preaching job on Sundays. And she was significantly and profoundly, irrevocably broken. You can't grow up like that and come out okay. She never had a single opportunity, and she was so whip smart that in her 80s, she took a volunteer position at a hospital, taught herself to use their computer, and then revamped and rewrote code for their entire computer system. This woman never had an opportunity to do anything, and she did all that. And I guess I wrote the book trying to understand all the ways in which she was broken, and the poverty that haunts them. DeLop is based on a real town in Alabama. It's not where my grandmother grew up because, she's where the story came from, but she's not what the story's about, if you see the difference. And there's a real town just like DeLop in Alabama, and it came to my attention through these Christmas letters. My brother's church answers their Christmas letters. And when he showed me the letters they were answering, one child was like, "Dear Santa, I want a little piece of tarp. Love, Chris." It's like, he wants a what? And my brother said he wants a little piece of tarp. And they went out there, and the child in the middle of Alabama, northern Alabama, coal mining country winter, is sleeping in a building where there's a hole that a possum could get through in the roof. And whenever it rains or snows, there's ice puddles on his floor. And he wanted a little piece of tarp so the rain couldn't get into his bedroom. It is a different world, and it's a closed world. I was not welcome there. Whenever I went up there, I wasn't allowed. My father's an Army guy, airborne ranger, and so is my brother. And they were like, "You are not going up to Surrey, Alabama by yourself. You'll be down in that quarry. We will never see you again." Every time we went up there, I went with one of them, and we went armed. I mean, not visibly armed, but, my dad made sure that we were armed. And the first time we drove into Surrey, they watched us and it was moving through the town that we were here, in our white pickup truck, strangers in town. And they don't have phones. They don't have anything like that. It moved through the town on foot faster than we could. And at one point we stopped, and these 2 boys, no shirts on, they'd been out working on this truck. And this is a scene I put right in the book. I put these 2 boys in the book. They came toward the car, one of them holding this wrench with this body language that was territorial. My father rolled down the window, and he leaned out and he said, "We're trying to drive down to the mine. Can we get down to the mine?" And there was this pause because there's an abandoned mine there. They ran out of coal, and these are the people who stayed when there were no jobs left and everybody left the town. These people have stayed and kind of bred, and they have their own little community. And their body language shifted. They're like, oh, there's some surveyors or something. And they said, no, you can't drive down there. It's all chained over. Here's where the path is. Here's where you go. And after that, as we drove around going to that path to get down to the mine, it stopped. The people coming out to see, what we were doing stopped. The news had traveled all through the town, and it was just this startling thing. And I knew that I can't revisit, the Depression-era Alabama where my grandmother sharecropped, but this was what I could find that was the closest thing to her life. So then I wrote a book about it because that's what I do. Yeah.
So, in taking...
Oh, no.
Oh.
Now I'm going to ask you a question. I'm just about, yeah. So, Jack.
Yes.
I loved your first book.
Oh, thank you.
I blatantly loved it. I loved it shamelessly, and it got glowing reviews. You've been compared in the good way to people like Lee Smith. And I'm excited that you have a new book coming out, so I thought I would ask you to tell me a little bit about it.
Well, I really don't like to talk about those things until they're out. Thank you. No.
All right. Well, thanks, y'all.
No, I do have a second book coming out. It's called The Fireman's Wife. It's been a long time in coming, and I'm looking forward to it actually debuting. It's going to come out. I'll be available December 30th. So why December 30th? I still don't know, but that's okay. And I guess it's because they know that everyone gets things for Christmas that you want to return. And so once you've returned your all these gifts that you don't want, you can take all that money and go buy a good book. Fireman's Wife takes place in the low country of South Carolina, begins in the low country of South Carolina in 1970. And it is about a couple who is getting ready to go through a divorce, or go through a separation, not a divorce. Peck and Cassie are the couple. Peck and Cassie have been married for 15 years. They have a young daughter who's 15 years old. Cassie, when she was 18 in 1954, went down to Myrtle Beach to work at a summer church camp. And she meets Peck, and they have this wonderful month of a romance. And then she goes back to Cashers, North Carolina, and a little fictitious town that actually the area is not fictitious at all. It's called Whiteside Cove. I just sort of made it more than what it actually is. And she finds out that she's pregnant, and her father rebukes her pretty much and sends her away. And Peck comes up and takes her back to the beach. It's all kind of the backstory, and so she has this child, and for 15 years she's lived along Murrells Inlet. And in the summer of 1970, the Low Country is embroiled in a very hot, dry drought that's been going on about 7 months, something we all sort of know something about here. And she is making a decision in her life that she's going to leave Peck and head back up to the mountains. She had been prepared to go to Western Carolina College at the time when she got pregnant. And so she has always sort of envisioned that that's what she would do again sometime. And now she thinks she's ready to do that. And she takes off with a man named Clay, who is also a fireman, who's leaving the Low Country and is headed to Walhalla, South Carolina, to become fire chief up there. So she sort of realizes very early on in the book that she's trading a fireman for a fireman, and well, that's not going to work. And so basically, it's just a story. It really becomes Cassie's journey from a journey of realization. I mean, really, it's kind of a coming-of-age story for a 30-year-old woman, a 33-year-old woman, and so she's trying to find herself on this journey. And so you have, and it's going to be told in 2 points of view. It's going to be told from Peck's point of view as well as Cassie's point of view. So each chapter sort of flip-flops back and forth. So you see the building up of this conflict from both sides of the coin. And so that's what my book is going to be about. I'll tell you what happens, but then they won't buy the book, so I won't do that.
We're coming up on the moment. Are you ready? Hey, do y'all have any questions? Oh, come on. We should have practiced. Yay! Well, the overstory is the story about two sisters. In the underside of the book, I think this is a book about poverty. I think this is a book about American poverty. We don't we don't think we have it. And the people who think they're poor in this country, I've been a missionary in Guyana, South America. The people who think they're poor in this country, we're not they're not all that poor. I mean, I've seen hungry. But we do have these people that we don't see because they're not mainstream. We don't ever see them. And they're all over in little pockets. It's bizarre. And people don't even know they're there because there's always the one meth dealer up there. So you're going around and there's all these trailers. Like up in Sari, Alabama, I saw these people literally living in a half a trailer. I mean that the trailer had broken in half and one half had been taken out and you could see straight into their house and they were living in there. And they're living in sheds and they've got pieces of fence, different kinds of fencing tied together, and everybody has skinny, upset-looking pit bulls. And you go around, and then there's this one trailer with a red Trans Am in front of it, and you think, well, I wonder what that boy does for a living, because he's dealing somewhere. He's going down and dealing. So, yeah, I think it's a book about poverty at its heart.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Yes. It all takes place in the present. Yeah. This book takes place over the course of about a week. So, like, while these sisters come out of this haunted past that they share, what you see is the results of it. Well, you find out some things. You come to know some stuff. I like to dig out those skeletons in the closet and rattle them around a little bit. So yeah, but I wouldn't say it goes back and forth in time. I would just say maybe some things come to light. Oh, I'm sorry. No. Okay. Yes, I will repeat the question. Yes.
You come up with a story line for a new book. Do you, in your head, finish the story before you start writing it, or do you start writing it and let it work itself out?
You want me to take that one?
Yeah,
I'll start. Okay. The question is, when we come up with an idea for a book, do we work that out completely, the storyline completely in our heads, or just whether it's in our head or on paper or something before we actually write the book? No. Um, I'm thinking back on When the Finch Rises. When I wrote that book, I started writing it as a collection of short stories. So I'd write the stories, and in that book, there's two boys, and Raybert Williams, they're both 12 years old, and Raybert Williams is telling basically the story, and he's telling it from a distance of an adult. He's an adult now, and he's looking back on this particular summer of 1968. And there's this little boy, Palmer Conroy, and Palmer's his best friend. And, I was writing these stories about Raybert and trying to sort of understand Raybert. And then one day I just sort of said, Palmer needs to have, or Raybert needs to have a friend. And so that's when I wrote a story about Palmer. And, I mean, that's the way Palmer sort of came into existence, because I felt that my little boy needed to have a friend. But once Palmer came in, then the dynamics of the whole thing changed. And then when I started writing the novel, I had about 6 short stories, and somebody said, you should write this as a novel rather than short stories. So I said, okay, I'll do that. And so when I started writing the novel, it really sort of shifted. What I thought I was going to do was take those short stories and just plug them in and keep going. So I thought, okay, now I have about a half a novel done, and this is now going to be easy. And of course, that never happens. And so what happens is you cannibalize those stories, and you have like one part of one short story might be toward the beginning, and a second part of that same short story may be in the back of the novel. And so so that's kind of the way that novel evolved, and I didn't know what was going to happen until, except for what of course I knew what was going to happen with the short story material, but as I plugged it in and kept going on, I didn't know what was going to happen in the book. And we can certainly talk about character at some point, because I know it's very, very important to Joshilyn. It's very important to me that character really sort of takes the story over. Once I understand my characters very, very well, they sort of begin telling me the story. And there's a wonderful sort of example of this. And as a writer, as an author, a lot of folks think that we just sort of already know how it's done, the whole process of writing. And I think I learn how to write every time I sit down to write. And one of the great experiences I had was with Palmer Conroy, when Palmer brought in the novel, Palmer and Raybert are hanging out in this closet, and at the beginning of the novel, and Palmer brings into the closet a photograph of a lynching of a black boy. And when I originally started to write that scene in the short story that I wrote about Palmer, he had come back to the closet with a bag full of pictures. Now, okay, so what he actually brings in the novel is a single picture of a black boy being lynched, and standing beside the tree where the body's hanging is his father, is Raybert's father. Palmer's given Raybert this as a gift. Now, in the short story, Palmer brings in a group of photographs of Palmer's sister, Cindy, naked, having been shot by Cindy's boyfriend. So you can see there's a big difference in those two things. So when I'm writing, so I'm sitting at my computer and I'm writing, and I'd gone down to the beach for like 2 weeks to write. And I was writing this scene, and I had the Palmer Conroy short story right here beside me, and I was just this is the part I was trying to plug in. And as I got to the scene where Palmer comes back to the closet, he had a picture, not pictures, and suddenly it became this lynching thing, and it was as if my fingers catapulted off of the keys. I did not want this in the book. I did not want Old South in the book. I did not want Faulkner South. I didn't grow up in that kind of South. I never saw lynching. I was never involved in an area of North Carolina where lynchings took place. I thought, oh my God, if I do this, the book is ruined. And so for the next 2 weeks, I tried to write that out. I wrote like 40 pages in 2 weeks. And at the end, toward the end of that 2 weeks, I said, I can't do this. This isn't working, because I kept thinking about that photograph. So I gave in, and I put about 10 pages back in, and I went home with my tail tucked under me, and I thought, I'll never finish this book because it's going to be a cliche, and it's going to read like that. And then when I got home and I looked at it and I read it, and I tried to continue to work on it, I started to realize what Palmer had given me. And Palmer gave me this. I didn't know this was going to happen. So when I got there, I started realizing that this was going to be an undercurrent. What happens with that in Finch is Raybert never settles with his father what's going on in the picture. The reader never really finds out. You sort of begin to understand what's happened in the book, and how the father is somehow connected to that, but you never understand the true connection. And what it does is it creates a tension between father and son that would not have been there had I not put it in there. And so that, to me, was one of those grand surprises that we get when we write, and when characters really begin to talk to us. It was a grand surprise. And I literally remember stopping and going, I have to remember this, because when characters talk to you, you have to listen. And in the second book, The Fireman's Wife, the same thing occurred toward the end of the novel, when my characters began to make choices that I wasn't sure I understood. And instead of fighting it this time, I sat there and I allowed it to happen. And it was so interesting because it was a lesson learned in my first book that helped me to understand what was going on in the second book. But that's a long way around to answer the question. But I don't know that I never do it. I never figure it out. I might know bits and pieces. The trigger might be the beginning, or the trigger may be that I know what happens in the end. But it's never that I understand the connection between. I have to let that go and trust my instincts and trust the characters to tell me where it's going.
And into the, what that leads to is if you don't know where you're going to end, how do you connect back to where you started?
You write. How do you, if you don't know where it's going to,
If you don't know, you might go 20,000 words and all, oh, I'm done.
You know
Right.
what? I
Instead of being, 80,000.
right, well,
I wrote 112,000 words of The Girl Who Stopped Swimming, and I didn't listen to my characters, and it was wrong, and I threw it away and started over. So what he says is exactly true. The other thing is that we were just talking about this in the car, the word count thing. I write books, they end up being between 80 and 100,000 words long, and I don't plan that. That's how long books are that are in my genre, and I have read so incessantly that I have internalized a sense of pacing. You read, and I write a book, I hit the word count function, it's 93,500 words. It just happens. And one of his students asked him, how do you know when to end a chapter? And he said, well, you end the chapter when it's over. It's just the intrinsic thing that it happens. And I think it happens when you've read enough to internalize it. It's like a cartwheel. You don't know how you do it. You just hurl yourself and go, and then you're back up on your feet, right side up again.
and we were talking about that in regards to teaching and how fearful I am when I get into a class and they start asking me questions because, it's like, first
It's
of
a
all,
mystery.
I scare them by I show them my books, because I do have the ARC of my new book. So I show them my books and I say, I know what I'm doing. And you don't, so don't question me. And then they start questioning me. And I don't know how to explain things. And one of the things is, what do you mean that the characters start talking to you? And I can say, all I can say is, I know that sounds crazy. But look, Palmer and Raybert are out there in the world in the same way that all of you are out there in the world to me. I've seen your faces here tonight. You'll walk away, and in my mind, in some ways, your faces will be burned into my mind, and just enough that I know you exist, and I know that I can think about you tomorrow night, and I'll know that you're somewhere out here in Decatur doing something in your homes or walking around or doing whatever, shoplifting or whatever it is you do. And I know that and so when I get emails from people who've read Finch, I like to think of them as postcards from the boys, as they're writing me to let me know that that they're okay, and they've been to college because Finch was picked up by Georgia Southwestern State for all the freshmen to read, and I got to go down there and give a keynote address and talk to the class, and I let them know I let the students at Georgia Southwestern State know that I was very proud of my boys for getting to college. I was very impressed with Palmer because I really never thought Palmer would make it. But it's so you can see it's all about character and letting the character tell the story, and then the story writes itself. And now that sounds like an arty thing to say. The story writes itself, but there's a lot of work in all that static that has to come through the writer to find that story. You still have to write it, and sometimes you don't know where you're going, and you just have to trust your instinct. And if you only write 20,000 words and you think you're done, then you weren't writing a book. That's the way you have to understand that. So you put that project over here, and you go on to something that seems to be longer. We had a question over here.
We would have very different answers to that question.
We would have. That's a good question.
I'm blessed. I'm blessed. I'm blessed. When Gods in Alabama was shot, I had it went to auction, and I had an opportunity to interview 4 different editors who wanted to buy it. And I was like midway through the first conversation before I realized that I was not being interviewed. I was interviewing them. It's kind of this, because, it's like I've been sitting in Georgia writing for 10 years, uh, sending out letters. Hey, my name's Joshilyn Jackson. I live in Georgia. I write books. Would you like to publish them in your fancy New York publishing house? Okay, thanks, bye, And so all of a sudden I have editors going, yeah, we would. So I spoke to these 4 different editors, and then my agent and I talked about where we wanted to go. And then as the auction continued, it came down to 2. And I had one of the 2 that had gotten a cap from her publisher that made them competitive. Their publisher had given them the exact same cap. So they hit their cap, and then it just got silly. It was like, well, we'll do exactly what we talked about, and we'll give you a puppy. Would you like a puppy? Nobody was going anywhere. So I just had to choose. And the editor I wanted was not the editor my agent wanted. The other editor was much more experienced, much more senior editor. And the editor I wanted got my stinking book. The first thing she said to me was, hey, my name's Karen. Now I will edit you. And I said, well, what does that mean? She goes, well, a lot of editors don't edit. They buy books and they publish them. But I edit. I'm a hands-on editor. And I said, well, tell me what that means. And she said, for example, there's a very important scene right at the beginning of that first published book, Gods in Alabama, where a girl beats a man to death with a tequila bottle. It's key. And it's a tequila bottle from Mexico. It's this glass bottle. I've seen them. They have a cork in them, and there's a worm, and there's no label on it, and it's very thick, and the base is very thick and bubbled. And it's full of tequila, and it's heavy because it's got that thick black base. And she sneaks up behind him, and she just lays him out. And my editor said, what happens to that bottle? There's a scene at the end of the book, and she told me where the scene was that bottle had to be in. And I was like, you're right. You're exactly right. And we have continued in this relationship where it's really like a Jack Nicholson, Helen Hunt situation where she makes me want to be a better man. I mean, she makes me better. She doesn't let me get away with stuff. She never lets me be sloppy. And when we have a fight over something, it's my book. It's going out under my name. It's not going to be published till I sign off on every change that's made, period. But that said, if she says something's wrong, it may not be what she thinks is wrong, but I've never had her say something's wrong and not found it. Even if she says, something's wrong here, maybe it's this, maybe it's this. When I look at it closely, I'll go, oh yeah, you're right. Or sometimes I'll go, no, it's this. And she'll go, yes, it's that. So, like, the end of Between is one of my favorite scenes. I think it's my most hopeful book. It's certainly I think all my books are hopeful. I'm an optimist. I'm a person of faith. I'm a Jesus girl. I'm all about the God. So I think that
Capital G.
Yeah, capital. Well, I like the little ones too.
Yeah.
But I think that most of my books are ultimately hopeful because that's where I live. That's how I see people. And maybe not everything doesn't just work out so tidy for everyone, but I love the end of Between. It ends with this image that was hugely powerful to me, just this triumph. And my editor says, okay, and we got to fix the ending image in between. I hate it. It doesn't have anything to do with the book. And I'm like, are you kidding me? That's the whole book captured in an image. And she's like, Bunny, are you on crank? It's not. And I said, Bunny, it is. And so I start taking her through the book and showing her all the places. And she's like, okay, I'm the most careful reader you'll ever meet. And nobody but maybe your mother would notice those things. And she was right. It was all buried and submerged. And I went through and like all the threads that bought me that ending, that purchased me that arms up, taking flight image were like underneath the blanket. If you flip the blanket over, you would see them. And so I had to pull those up to the surface so they were woven all through the book. And when you get to the end, so I rewrote that thread, just spent like 2 weeks on it, centered the book, and she's like, now I see the ending. So for me, and I've had the same editor for my first 3 books. I'm about to turn in my 4th book, and I've sold her the next book. She said, I'd like to buy your next book. I said, do you want to hear what it is? She said, well, if you want to tell me, but I'll buy it. I said, all righty then. So, I mean, we're just, as long as she wants to edit me, I'll stay there.
I wish I had her. No, what you heard Jocelyn say is that the editor, she said that she wants to buy the book. And you need to understand that editors buy books. Publishing houses don't buy books. I mean, they give the editors the money. But the editors are the ones that stick their neck out there. And if they buy books that don't sell, then they're not going to stay very long at that particular house. Maybe that's my problem. Um, I don't know if you all remember some years ago an author named Jeannie Brazelton. She wrote a book called False Sense of Well-Being was her first novel, and incredibly good and successful first novel. And Jeannie passed away before she was able to finish her second novel. Jeannie and I had the same agent, and I didn't find that out until after Jeannie had passed away, that we had the same agent. I knew Jeannie, and we had talked, and had I known that, I was hoping, there's part of me that says, well, God, if I'd have just talked to Jeannie, maybe things wouldn't have happened that happened, but that's another guilt story of mine. But our agent and Jeannie's editor from Ballantyne came down to Georgia from New York, and I took them to Jeannie's funeral. And this is a weird story because here I had never met my agent personally. I had never met, and of course my book was still being shopped around. And so we come down, and we're first of all, I get him in the car, and we're driving up to Rome, Georgia, and I get lost. And we're driving all over the country. We get there, the funeral's almost over by the time we get there. And we were there for a little bit, and then the funeral's over, and we go to the cemetery, and then we went to McDonald's to eat lunch. And I'm sitting there, and Stella, my agent, goes outside to check her emails, and I'm sitting there with Maureen O'Neill, who is this editor from Ballantyne, and we've just been to the funeral of Jeannie Brazelton, and she says, I like your book. And I went, well, that's good. And she said, I've read it a couple of times. I'm going to read it again, and then I'll talk to you about it. And then she said something that was just sort of really weird. She said, I seem to have a spot open. And I thought, okay, this is macabre. And she bought it. 2 weeks later, she bought the book. And Maureen O'Neill was a great editor. She really worked hard with me on the book. It didn't take very long. Finch was purchased in April, and because Maureen purchased it, she wanted to put it in where Jeannie's book was supposed to have been put in, which was in like October of that year. So the book was purchased. Usually a book is purchased and it comes out a year later. It takes a whole year for the process to happen. Which, because you go through the editorial process, and then they go through the marketing and the ARC process and everything. Well, all of mine was sort of condensed into a few months. So we went from April to October, the book was out. And then, of course, I said to Maureen, of course, in the middle of all this, Maureen says, I want to buy another book. What do you have? And so I told her this crazy idea that I had for this really different book, a book that would go a completely different way from what When the Finch Rises was about. And it took some convincing, but we talked for hours on the phone about this. And I said, I don't know that I can write this book, but I want to try to write it, and I need you to be there as an editing editor. Because really, in New York today, they want the book so polished and so finished that there's just cosmetic stuff done to it, and then they publish it. So they don't have editors like they did in the old days, where the editor takes the book and who's it? Faulkner's editor was supposedly the one who made Faulkner, or Hemingway's editor made Hemingway. They don't do that anymore, and most of them are 30-something women. I mean, that's who seems to be editors in New York. So if you're 30-something and you're a woman, you can probably become an editor in New York.
If you have a degree from Brown.
Right, right. And they all sound the same on the phone, too. It's really weird. It's kind of like Stepford Rice or something. Anyway, so I told Maureen, I said, I gave her this whole layout of what I wanted to do. I sent her a chapter, and she bought the book. And then she never saw another word because she got fired. And my agent said, don't worry about that. They'll put you with someone else that will really do well with the book. And that never really happened. I won't go through the whole grim story, but eventually I wrote this, what I think is a great book, and it was rejected by Ballantine. Just outright rejected. They did not want it. It was not Finch 2. It wasn't my genre, and they didn't know what to do with it. And so that was, I did get a second editor, and then she's the one who rejected the book. And then she asked me, what else do you have? We're not going to, this book that you've just bled 2 years over.
What else you got?
What else you got, right? And so I literally, we talk about, our books become our babies.
Oh, no. You don't sell your baby.
Yeah.
No, you don't.
Well, my books become my babies because I would sell them if I could get enough money for my kids.
I think of books as boyfriends. I'd
Oh.
sell a boyfriend. But yeah.
Well, okay. My books are my girlfriends. No, but what I'm trying to say is that you fall in love with your books.
Yeah.
And you write your books because you love your books. Now, when I wrote The Fireman's Wife, I like to say this because it's very important to me for people to understand. Fireman's Wife started off as a book of necessity. It was a book that came out of What Else You Got. And I didn't want to lose a contract, and I didn't know what I was going to do. So I'm sitting down at the beach, and I've just reread Larry Brown's memoir on fire. And this condo where we stay, there's this fire station right next door, and I heard a fire engine go out, and I'm talking to my agent on the phone, and she says, "What you got?" And I said, "I think I'm going to write a book about a fireman." And so I said, "Give me a week, and I'll get back to you." And so I wrote like the first couple of chapters, and I thought it was going to be a book about a fireman, okay, because I loved Larry, and Larry was very important to me in my career. And when he died over that Thanksgiving weekend, I didn't find out about it till later. Silas House actually called me, I think, and said, "Isn't it a shame what happened to Larry?" And I went, "What happened to Larry?" And he said, "He died, dude." And so I've held this inside for a long, long time, and so I wanted to write a book about a fireman. But it ended up being a book about a fireman's wife because I didn't have control over it. Cassie took control.
I want to talk about the baby thing. This is something I tell writers all the time when I'm teaching, because we do tend to think of them as our babies. And I had 2 books that I wrote before God's in Alabama that did not sell, and it almost killed me. I went to live under a bed for a year because they were my babies. And how did you not like my babies, you stinking, terrible, evil New Yorkers?
Careful.
It hurt me in my feelings.
She's been up since 3 o'clock this morning.
I have. I got up and I drafted chapter 10. Hooah. So, I've learned to think of books as a romance. And the book I'm with now is the book I'm writing, and I love my book I'm writing. Me and my book I'm writing, we make out and we hold hands and we run around. And if you say one darn mean thing about the book I'm writing, I will slap you in the next week, because that is my baby. That's my honey. The book I finished is like my ex. And we broke up very amicably. I want only the best things for my ex. I want my ex to meet the New York Times reviewer, and I want them to have a romance and really like each other. And I want my ex to go on and date bestseller lists and readers all over the country. It's one of those exes where you think of them fondly, and when they have successes, you're really pleased. But if somebody says something mean about them or doesn't like them, you don't have your identity there. I put my heart in the book I'm writing. And when it's finished, there's something psychologically that I've learned to do. I give it to my editor, she gives me a check, and it's not my book anymore. And if you write a check out there, it can be your book, and you can think whatever you like about it. And I will not fault you if you think I did something wrong on page 65 and you like the book, but why did I make her do this? That didn't seem real to you. That's okay. You get to have that opinion, and it won't hurt my feelings because my heart is in the book I'm writing now. That's where I live. How much time do we have before how are we doing, Joe? Maybe one more? All right, so maybe one more.
Yeah. Yes. I wear my wife's underwear. No. Um, oh, I bet it right because this is going. Yeah, yeah. The question was, that would be wild. The question was, how do I? Yeah, right, right. Yeah, let's erase that. No, the question was obviously how does a man write from a woman's perspective, like a coming of age kind of thing, or any way as a woman. I think that's a great question, and I think as writers we have to be able to do it. We have to wherever we have to go because that's what we do. We write. Um, and I start off. It's a very sort of technical thing that I did to start it, which was when I was writing Cassie's chapters, I didn't use conjunctions. Now that sounds weird, but that's the way I started it. I wrote it in a sort of more formal language because Cassie, to me, even though she's the one that's going through all the problems, she has sort of a strong sense of balance in a lot of ways, and she seems to be more proper in some way. She's the mother, and that's the way I started it. I didn't end up like that, but that's the way I did it. And then when I was writing Peck, I was using contractions, and I was, and there was more, there was cussing, and the language is a little bit lazier in Peck's chapters. But then I also started, I started thinking about my wife, and I started thinking about her behavior patterns and the way she talked to me and the way I started watching her and I would observe her and I was able, I think, to draw from that uh, the sense of the feminine woman that I needed to have for this book. She's kind of desperate at times because she's looking so hard for things, but other than that, I'm not sure. Through revision and thinking about how a woman would respond versus how a man would respond, and I think that's why I did alternating chapters, because some of the stuff that happens overlaps, and so the time frame overlaps or the scenes overlaps, even though the characters are apart most of the time. Like in Backstory, when Cassie's considering backstory that Peck later considers. She considers it one way, he considers it another. And I was able to draw a distinction there. And mostly everyone who's read it, my wife and obviously my editor and all of those ladies, all think I did okay. I mean, I think I've done all right with it. I feel like when I'm reading Cassie, I really feel like I'm reading Cassie, not some figment of my imagination or anything. She feels very real and very much a woman in the book. So, how do you write men?
Oh, I don't. I try to kill them off in chapter 1. No. I mean, the same way. I've lived with. I get in trouble sometimes writing men because one of the things that I get criticized for, that I've heard from more than one, reviewer, is that my male characters are not as realistic as my female characters. That they sometimes seem a little bit too good to be true. And I thought, compared to my father and my husband and my brother, the men in my book are kind of jerks. I've been blessed by mighty and beautiful men in my life. And I'm raising one of my own who has that same kind of enormous heart. And so these are the men I write. This is my experience of men. And my father's kind of a superhero, and I didn't get married until I found a man that I thought lived up to that. My dad raised me right. And I remember when I was like 12 or 13, my father started taking me out, just the two of us. He would say, "You know what? Why don't you go put on something pretty? I'm going to take you to dinner." And he would take me to dinner, and he would pull the chair out for me, and he would listen to what I said and ask me questions about my day. Or he'd say, we'd just be in jeans, he'd say, "Let's go see a movie." And then he would ask me my opinions about the movie, and he would open doors for me. And 3 years later, when I started dating, if a boy didn't treat me like that, I didn't like that boy. It was really smart. And that's just the kind of guy he was. He was a war hero, larger than life kind of fella. And um, everyone, like when we went to his retirement party, when he retired, everyone came up to me and just at a certain point in the night, literally more than 50 people took me aside and said, "I don't know if you know this, what a privilege you've had, but you've been raised by a good man. This is just one of the best men I've ever known." So I think that, that's where I write from. I've been blessed with men like that in my life. The women in my life have been somewhat more complicated. I have herds and herds of rabidly insane aunties, and so yeah. So I tend, I am a woman, and I tend to write more. My main characters tend to be women, but I've lived with men my whole life. They're half the population. I've been involved in relationships with them for, I'm 40 years old. I've met a few. So, and it's a matter of empathy. I think as writers, I'm good at putting myself in someone else's shoes and thinking what they would do.
You have to be. That's what you
Yeah,
have to be able
it's
to do.
empathy.
Yeah.
He's asking if Southern writers bring something different to the table than other writers, and to that I say, abso-stinking-lutely we do. Um, we are a culture in a country that is becoming more and more homogenized by the internet and the television. And you go out to eat at your Applebee's, and then you fly across the country and you say, "I know, let's go to Applebee's," and you eat the exact same thing. And it's just, I don't understand how there can be a stinking Applebee's surviving in New York Times Square, which is nothing but tourists. Who goes to New York and goes, "I want some baby back ribs"? I mean, what is that? Um, and
A little bit of home.
well, it's not a little bit of home.
No, I know.
Applebee's is no one's home. I mean, the Blue Willow is someone's home. But here in this, what? Yeah, Cracker Barrel.
Yeah.
Waffle House, La La Raphael, Shea Waffle. But here, I think that there are pockets of a culture that is different from the rest of the country in significant ways and recognizably different. I think every region has its own kind of a thing, but there's a mystique to the South, and we are, Flannery O'Connor called us Christ haunted. That is, she was a devout Catholic, and she nailed it. We are, all our grounds are soaked in blood and history, and I don't know a place. I lived in Chicago for 7 years, and it just felt, I mean, it was cold, but that wasn't it. It was that I didn't walk onto the battlefields up there and, this place is, there are stories in the dirt, and they get up through us. And also, we're slow people. We are slow. It's hot. In Chicago, you're like, "It's really stinking cold, and I'm going to go from A to B as fast as I can." In the South, you can't move like that. You ask for directions in Chicago, they say, 2 blocks north, turn right. 4 blocks north, turn west. That's it. And then they leave, and you're like, "What?" In the South, right? "Well, now you're going to want to go up toward Jim Bob's farm, and it's red, and now that's the place where his horse got the colic and died kicking and stove my Aunt Jeannie's head in. And then you're going to," we're storytellers, and it's because we don't want to get out of our chairs. It's stinking hot. We're not going to go play tennis. We're going to sit down, have a julep, and tell you the story of our lives. We have a huge oral tradition here that is not the same in the rest of the country. They don't tell stories like we tell stories down here. So, yeah, I would say yeah. Yeah, we do.
I think it's. I agree with that, but also I see a place like Atlanta, and I see how it's changing, and it's going to be interesting to see the next generation of writers coming up from the South and what their stories are going to be. I don't. I mean, I think it's going to change, but I don't know how it's going to change. The South is not the South uh, that I grew up in anymore, and I mean, it's going to be very interesting to watch that. But I think it is because we're storytellers. I mean, and I think that it's because uh, I would just say the heat, but the climate. I mean, we are a porch-sitting, or we were a porch-sitting society that told story. We lived through story much more so than other regions. And I do believe, as Justin,
And geography. You
yeah,
can't go in a straight line. It's hill country. You know, you can't go, none of the roads are in straight lines. You go to Chicago, it's a grid. It's A to B.
right.
We wind. The geography of the way we build our roads slows us down and makes us look around us.
And it's also the war.
The war.
And I was,
The war of northern aggression.
that's right. When I came here,
Slavery. Slavery haunts us. We're haunted by slavery. What an ugly thing we let live among us for so long.
well, when I first came here in '93, the big flag debate was still raging,
What's that?
and I couldn't believe it. I mean, I could not believe what was the way that changing that flag could create such turmoil in a state, and it really did. So, how many more years is it going to take for us to get beyond that kind of an issue? Um, and I think, I think all those make us different. Make us I guess the Yankees in the South in Boston, you walk around there, it's all revolution. And that has a different, that means something different. Those battlefields mean something
They
different.
won.
Yes, I mean, it is. It is. It's about winning and losing, and so in some ways it colors the characters that
It
we
is.
create.
I mean, I'm talking about the revolution, not the Civil War. They're
Right.
yeah, they
They
won.
won.
We won too,
Well,
but
the
it's
battle-
theirs,
We won the battles, but we lost the war. Well, we didn't lose the war, but the South, at the time lost the war. But
And it was good. We needed to lose that stinking war,
Yeah.
but it certainly has shaped our culture.
yeah, and I think it still resonates, even though we're getting further away. The question is, as we homogenize, as we shift, and the map begins to um, dissolve away into something new, what will we be? And that's a good question. I don't know. When I was writing Finch, I was saying, the whole thing about the lynching and all, I was going, this is not my South. This is not my South.
Yeah.
But once I finished writing that scene and I came back and I kept working on the book, Emory University had over at their art museum, they had the lynching photographs that were brought in. And then there was the guy in Texas, the black man in Texas, who was pulled behind the truck, and they called that a lynching so back in that time. So suddenly I realized I'm not that far away from it. It's really not. So and that certainly helped me understand what this book was doing, and it also kind of helped me understand where we are in the South. So.
One of the things my father did for me when I talk about the way he's a hero, they grew up in Leeton, Alabama, okay? They got married at 19, joined the Army, saw the world, and they realized that the way they had been raised was not right. And when they had children, they went to their parents. I mean, this is mighty. This was subversive and mighty. They went to their parents and said, here's a list of words you will never say in front of our children. Here's a list of ideas you will never express or support by thought, word, or deed in front of our children. And the day you express these abhorrent views or words in front of our children is the day you will not see our children anymore. And so I grew up protected from that, not knowing that I was related to a bunch of virulent racists. And when I became an adult, they quit protecting me and let me see these people I loved. My beautiful grandmother who smelled like cookies had a worldview I found abhorrent. And that has certainly fueled my writing, that generational racism where I love this woman. I love this woman. I cannot love these things that she believes, and I cannot, she's not going to change, Lord, you know, and I'm not going to change. And where do you compromise? Where, when it comes down between love and ideology, where do you compromise? I write about that a lot, and that's the Southern thing.